In the high, lonesome country above the Madison River, in the Montana Territory in the autumn of 1887, there stood a trapper's lodge that 3 buyers had walked away from before a woman with $11 in her pocket walked toward it. The men who came before her had pried up a board or two, found nothing but packed earth and old fur grease soaked into the planking, and declared the place stripped to the bone. The seller agreed with them, smiling, and named a price so low it was meant to insult. What none of them had brought to that empty room was the one thing the lodge required. A patient hand, taught to read a floor the way a cooper reads the grain of a stave, knew that a building does not forget what it was built to hide. Her name was Della Voss, and she was 28 years old, and she had come north from the Wyoming line with a satchel of tools that had belonged to a dead man, and almost nothing else. You may meet a great many people in a long life who tell you a thing is worthless. Remember her, and remember what she found. The next time someone swears an empty room is only empty. Then the wind off the snowfields pushed the lodge door open another inch, and she stepped inside to begin. She had been raised to the trade by her uncle, a millwright and cabinetman named Aaron Voss, who had built half the grain elevators along the eastern slope and never once trusted a floor he had not laid himself. He had taken her in when she was 9, after the fever took her mother, and he had set her on a stool beside his bench and put a smoothing plane in her small hands before she could spell her own surname. He taught her the weight of timber. He taught her that wood lies the way men lie, by omission, and that the truth of a board is in what sits beneath it. When he died, 4 winters back, of a cough that the cold settled into his chest, he left her the bench tools and a single sentence she had carried like a coin in a closed fist. A floor laid level over uneven ground, he had told her, is a floor laid over something a man did not want walked upon. The lodge had come to her by accident, in the way that the things that matter often do. She had been working a season at a sawmill in Ennis, sorting cull lumber for a wage that barely kept her boarded, when she heard 2 freighters in the yard speak of a trapper's place up the Cabin Creek draw that no one would buy. The trapper, they said, had been a man named Silas Renner, who ran a long line through the gravelly range and vanished one spring without paying his accounts. The lodge had reverted to the man who held the note on it, a stock dealer in Virginia City called Howell Tate, and Tate wanted it off his books. 3 men had looked. 3 men had passed. The freighters laughed about it, the way men laugh at a thing they do not understand, and one of them said that the only treasure in that cabin was the smell. Della went to see Howell Tate on a Tuesday in his office above a feed store, and she found him a soft and unhurried man who counted her coins twice and made a joke about a woman buying a ruin. He was broad through the middle and pale as a man who works indoors, and he wore a watch chain across his vest that he touched now and then, as though to reassure himself it was still there. He told her the lodge was empty. He told her the floor had been gone over by men who knew what they were about, and that she was paying $11 for a roof and 4 walls and the privilege of hauling out a dead man's stink. She said that suited her. He laughed at that, a short, comfortable laugh, and remarked that it was a strange day when a girl had more sense than 3 grown men, by which he meant that she had less. He signed the paper with a flourish and pushed it across the desk and did not rise when she left. She noticed, going out, that his ledger lay open on a side table and that it was the cleanest thing in the room. Its columns ruled in 2 colors of ink, the figures black and the corrections a faded red, every line squared and balanced as if the book had been kept by a man who loved order more than money. The rest of the office was cluttered with the ordinary debris of a stock dealer, tally sheets and brand books, and a spittoon and a wall of pigeonholes stuffed with paper. Only the ledger was immaculate. She filed that away without yet knowing why, the way her uncle had taught her to notice the one board in a wall that had been sanded smoother than its neighbors. Because the board a man takes pains to hide is the board worth lifting. The road up the draw took the better part of a day on a hired mule, and the lodge sat at the end of it like a thing the mountain had half swallowed. It was low and square, built of squared logs chinked with clay, with a sod roof gone to grass and a single iron stovepipe canted at an angle that told her the chimney footing had shifted. The door hung on one leather hinge. Inside, the air was close and rank with the years of grease and smoke and animal, and the light came in gray through a window of oiled hide that no one had ever glazed. She stood in the doorway a long moment and let her eyes adjust. And she did what her uncle had taught her to do in any new room. She did not look at the walls. She looked at the floor. It was a plank floor, which was itself a curiosity in a trapper's cabin so far from any mill. Most men in such places lived on packed dirt and were glad of it. Silas Renner had hauled sawn boards up a day's hard road and laid them tight, and a man does not do that for comfort alone. The planks were wide, pit-sawn, dark with use, and they ran the length of the room from the hearth to the far wall, where the earlier buyers had pried near the door. The boards were splintered and shoved back crooked, and beneath them she could see the same packed earth that had sent those men home. She knelt and pressed her palm flat to the wood and felt the cold of the ground come up through it, and she understood at once why the others had been fooled. They had tested the floor where a man would expect a floor to be tested. They had not asked the floor where it was lying. She spent the first day not digging, but listening. She fetched her uncle's tools from the satchel and laid them out on the hearthstone, in the order he had kept them, the way another woman might lay out a service of china. A 12-pound maul, a set of oak wedges, a cooper's adze with a handle worn to the shape of a hand that was not hers, a pry bar, a mallet, a brace of chisels, and a long iron rod he had used for sounding posts and beams. She took up the rod and went down the floor on her knees, tapping each plank along its length, listening to the note that came back. A board over solid earth gives a dead, flat sound, a sound with no room in it. A board over a hollow sings. She had learned the trick of it as a girl, kneeling beside her uncle on the floor of a half-built granary, while he made her close her eyes and tell him, by ear alone, where the joists ran beneath. You cannot trust your eyes on a floor, he had told her then, because a floor is built to be looked at and not looked through. You must trust your hands and your ears, which a builder cannot lie to. She had been impatient with the lesson at 9 years old. She was grateful for it now. For most of the floor, the note was dead. She tapped and moved and tapped again, working in a slow grid from the door inward, and the lodge gave her nothing. And the light failed, and she slept that night wrapped in her coat on the hearthstone with the mule tethered at the door. She did not mind the cold. She had slept colder. In the morning she began again at the hearth end, where the planks butted against the great flat stone, and on the third tap, 2 boards in from the chimney, the rod came back with a different voice. Not a song exactly, a change, a faint openness under the wood, where there should have been the dull press of the ground. She held still and tapped it again to be sure her ears had not invented what she wanted to hear. The change held. She marked the spot with a knife scratch and worked outward from it, tapping, listening, marking, until she had drawn on the floor with the point of her knife the rough outline of a rectangle. It was perhaps 4 feet by 3. It lay directly before the hearth, in the one part of the room a man stood in every day of his life, the last place a careful searcher would think to lift, because it was the place most plainly in use. What she did not yet know was that the rectangle she had scratched into the floor would undo a man 40 miles away who believed himself entirely safe. The boards above the hollow had been laid as cunningly as anything she had ever seen, and she felt, looking at them, a strange kinship with the dead trapper she would never meet. He had countersunk the nails and plugged the holes with pegs of the same wood, then sanded the pegs flush so that the floor read as one unbroken run. A man pries at a plank by its edge, levering against its neighbor. These planks had been cut with a hidden tongue and rabbet, so that no edge stood proud to take a bar. To open them, you had to know they opened. You had to know where the first board would lift, and you had to lift it from the right end, and you had to do it without splitting the wood, because a split would tell the next man what the whole floor was hiding. She sat back on her heels and understood that Silas Renner had not been a careless man who skipped out on his debts. He had been a craftsman, and a careful one, and careful men do not vanish without a reason. She worked the first board free across the whole of an afternoon. She found the peg that hid the keying nail and drilled it out with a hand brace, turning slow, blowing the curl of shaving away, until the bit dropped through into open air below, and a thread of cold came up out of the floor that was older and stiller than the cold of the room. That breath of trapped air, sealed who knew how long beneath the planking, told her more than any deed in Howell Tate's clean ledger. She set the bit aside. She slid a thin chisel into the seam she had opened, found the tongue, and walked the blade along it with the patience of a woman threading a needle in poor light. Twice the blade caught, and she stopped and backed it out and started again, because her uncle had told her that a man who forces a joint breaks it, and a broken thing tells everyone what was hidden in it. The board came up at last with a long, dry groan, and she lifted it away and set it down as gently as a sleeping child, and she leaned over the gap and looked into the dark. There were stairs. Not a hole, not a root cellar dug for turnips, but a short flight of 3 timber steps, squared and joined, leading down into a chamber that a man had taken real labor to build beneath his own hearth. She lit a candle stub from her satchel and lowered it on a string, and the small flame steadied and showed her a room perhaps 6 feet on a side, dry as the inside of a drum, its walls lined with the same sawn plank as the floor above, its air the held breath of years. Along one wall ran a shelf, and on the shelf sat objects she could not yet name, shapes under oilcloth, and at the foot of the steps stood a small iron strongbox with a hasp, but no lock, as if whoever closed it last had meant to come back the same week. She did not go down at once. Her uncle's voice was in her, telling her that a hole a man digs in secret is a hole that can fall, and she spent the last of the daylight cutting 2 stout props from a deadfall pine outside and setting them under the floor joists at the edge of the opening, so that the weight of the lodge could not come down on her while she was beneath it. She squared the ends of the props with the adze so they would seat true against the joists and not slip, and she drove a flat stone under each foot to keep it from sinking into the earth. A man in a hurry would have skipped it. Her uncle had been buried by a falling beam, in the end, in a granary another man had braced carelessly, and she had not forgotten the lesson of his death any more than the lessons of his life. Only when the props were seated and the opening shored did she take her candle and her uncle's adze and go down the 3 steps into the room that no buyer before her had known was there. Around this point in the telling, it is worth stopping for one breath. If you have ever been told that you were looking in the wrong place, that there was nothing to find, that the matter was settled by men who knew better, you already understand what Della felt with her boots on that bottom step. Now, let us go down with her and see. The objects under the oilcloth were furs, not the common beaver and muskrat of a working line, but the rare and the protected and the carefully chosen marten and otter and lynx and a single great silver-tip bear hide, folded with its head still on, each pelt dressed and salted and rolled and tied, each in a condition that told her they had been the best of years of work. She lifted a corner of the oilcloth, and the smell that came up was not the rank grease of the room above, but the clean, cold smell of well-cured hide, the smell of a man who had known his trade and done it with care. There were 40 of them, and even in the candlelight she could see they were worth more than the lodge and the mule, and a year of her wages laid end to end. It was not the furs that stopped her hand, though. It was the strong box. She knelt before it and lifted the hasp and raised the lid, and inside, wrapped in waxed paper against the damp, lay a bound book and a sheaf of loose papers, and a small canvas sack that chinked when the lid's motion stirred it. The book was a ledger, and it was not Silas Renner's account of his furs. It was a record of a different kind of trade, kept in a small, precise hand, and as she read it by the guttering candle, the cold in the little room seemed to deepen. Renner had kept, year by year, a tally of payments made to him and demanded of him by a man he named only by initials at first, and then, in a later and angrier hand, by a full name. Howell Tate. The trapper had been paying Tate a portion of every season's catch, not as honest interest on an honest note, but as the price of being let alone. Tate held notes on a dozen such men scattered through the Gravelies and the Madison, small trappers and woodcutters and a placer miner or two, men who could not read a contract closely and had signed what was put before them, and Tate had written those contracts so that the debt could never be paid down, only fed. The ledger named them. The ledger named the sums, and the ledger, in its final entries, named the thing that Silas Renner had decided to do about it. He had decided to gather the proof. The loose papers in the strong box were the originals, or true copies, of the contracts themselves, the real ones, before Tate's clean office ledger had recopied them into something the law would bless. A man cannot easily prove he was cheated by a paper he himself signed. Renner had been cunning, however, and he had kept the first drafts, the ones with the figures scratched out and rewritten in Tate's 2 colors of ink, the ones that showed a debt of $40, swollen to $400 by a stroke that added a 0, and called it a clerk's correction. He had meant to take them to the territorial court at Virginia City. He had meant to undo the whole quiet machine of it. And somewhere between the meaning and the doing, Silas Renner had stopped paying his accounts and was never seen on his line again. Della sat with the ledger open on her knees for a long time. She was not a woman given to weeping, and she did not weep now, but she felt the weight of the little room settle on her, the weight of a man who had built a hiding place under his own feet and filled it with the truth and then was gone before he could spend it. The cold air she had let out of the floor had been the air he sealed in. She was breathing what he had breathed last. She closed the book and wrapped it again in its waxed paper, and she made herself a promise in the dark that she would keep. And then she went up the 3 steps into the gray daylight and sat on the hearthstone and ate the last of her bread and thought about what a woman with $11 and another man's proof could possibly do. She did not yet know whether Renner was dead by Tate's hand or by the mountains, and she would never know for certain. And she decided early that it did not matter to what she had to do. What mattered was the paper. What mattered was that 40 miles down the draw, there were men still paying, still signing, still being fed a debt that grew in the night like a thing alive. She thought of going straight to the law, and then she thought of Howell Tate's clean ledger ruled in 2 colors, and she understood that a stranger walking into a territorial court with a dead man's book would be a stranger contradicting the most respectable note holder in the county. She needed more than the paper. She needed someone the court would believe, and she needed the men in the ledger to stand where their names stood. There was an old woman who lived 2 miles down the creek, in a soddy with a goat and a stand of beehives, and the freighters had spoken of her too, with the wary respect men give to someone they cannot put a price on. Her name was Mercy Galt, and she had been in that country since before the war, and she had buried 2 husbands and a son, and outlasted the lot of them. Della walked down to her on the second morning after the discovery, because a woman alone in the mountains learns quickly that the only wealth that keeps is a neighbor. She found Mercy Galt at her hives in a veil of cheesecloth, working the frames with bare hands, as though the bees were old acquaintances who would not dream of stinging her, and she did not waste the old woman's time with anything but the truth. "I bought the Renner place," Della said. "There is a room under the floor that no one knew of. There is a ledger in it that names Howell Tate, and a dozen men he has been bleeding. I mean to set it right, and I cannot do it alone." Mercy Galt looked at her for a long moment over the cheesecloth, her pale eyes steady in a face brown and seamed as a walnut, and then she set down her smoker and lifted the veil from her head, and she said the thing that told Della she had found her ally. "I knew Silas Renner," the old woman said. "He mended my hives the spring before he disappeared, and he told me he had a card to play against that soft devil in Virginia City. And then he was gone, and I thought he had run." Her voice was quiet, but it did not shake. "Everyone said he had run. I should have known better," she said, half to herself, because Silas Renner was not a man who left a thing unfinished. Then she fixed Della with that steady look again. "If you have his card," the old woman said, "then we will play it, and I will stand up in any court in the territory and say I knew the man and knew his mind. Now, show me." What followed was not the work of a day. Over the next 2 weeks, while the first real snow held off and the passes stayed open, the 2 women did the patient, unglamorous labor that justice is actually made of. Mercy Galt knew the country and the men in it, and one by one she sent word down the creeks and over the low divides, by a boy on a pony and by a peddler who passed that way, and by the slow telegraph of mouth to mouth that serves a country without wires. And one by one the men named in Silas Renner's ledger came up the draw to the lodge, wary and ashamed and disbelieving, to see their own names written in a dead man's hand. There was a Norwegian woodcutter named Lars Holt, who had paid Tate $200 on a debt that began at 30, and could not understand why it never shrank, and who stood over the open ledger with his hat in his 2 hands and read his own name 3 times before he believed it. There was a placer miner named Eli Crane, who had signed his claim away in all but name, a stooped and suspicious man who had taught himself never to trust a paper and had been cheated anyway, because the cheating was in the copying and not the signing. There was a widow, Ruth Pell, whose husband had died still owing on a note he had paid 3 times over, and whose grown son had been told the debt was now his, and who sat very straight at Della's table and pressed her lips together and didn't speak for a long while after she saw the figures. Each of them, coming in, said some version of the same thing. They had been told the matter was settled. They had been told the debt was lawful. The paper was binding. The men who held the notes knew the law, and they did not. They had been made to feel that the fault was in themselves, in their poor reading and their rough hands, and their inability to argue with a soft man in a clean office. Della watched the thing happen in face after face, the slow turn from shame to something harder and clearer, as each of them understood that they had not been stupid. They had been robbed by a man who had made the robbery look like arithmetic. It was Ruth Pell's son who nearly undid the whole thing, and it is worth telling how, because it shows the kind of woman Della Voss was. The young man, whose name was Thomas, was angry in the way that helpless men are angry, and he wanted to ride to Virginia City and put a fist or worse into Howell Tate, and he said as much in the lodge with the ledger open on the table between them all. He was on his feet with his fists closed, and his voice rising before his mother could take his sleeve. Della heard him out. She did not tell him he was wrong to be angry. She let the anger spend itself in the small room until it had nowhere left to go. Then she put her hand flat on the dead trapper's book and said that the moment any one of them raised a hand to Tate, they handed him the story he wanted, the story of violent debtors and a put-upon honest man, and they would lose everything Silas Renner had died to gather. "We do not touch him," she said. "We do not need to touch him. We let the paper do it." Her voice was quiet, but it did not waver, and there is a kind of quiet that carries further than a shout. The room was still. Then Mercy Galt said, from her place by the stove, that the girl was right, and that she had buried 3 men in that country, and learned that the loud ones get buried first. Thomas Pell looked at his mother, and at the old woman, and at last at Della, and he put his anger back in his pocket where it could do no harm, and the work went on. The proof had to be made whole. A dead man's ledger was a strong thing but not a sufficient thing, and Della knew it. So she did what her uncle would have done with a doubtful joint, which was to test it against every other piece until the whole structure stood on its own. She had each man bring what papers he had, the contracts Tate had given them, the clean recopied ones, and she laid them beside the originals from the strongbox, and where the 2 disagreed she marked the disagreement plainly. The 40 become 400, the interest compounded against its own terms, the dates altered to start the clock early. She worked at the table by the window for the better part of a week, the originals on her left and the recopies on her right, and a fair sheet in the middle, and she found that the more she compared, the clearer the pattern grew. The corrections were always in the same hand. They always moved the figure in the same direction. They were always small enough to pass for a clerk's slip, and large enough, summed over years, to swallow a man's whole living. She copied it all out fair in her own clear hand, 2 copies of everything. Every altered figure shown beside its true one, every false date beside the real. Mercy Galt witnessed each page with her name and her mark, sitting across the table with her spectacles low on her nose and reading every line aloud before she would sign it, because the old woman said she had put her name to a thing unread exactly once in her life and had paid for it for 10 years. Lars Holt and Eli Crane and Ruth Pell signed beside their own altered contracts to swear the alterations were not theirs. Eli Crane's hand shook so that he made 2 attempts at his own name, and Della waited and did not hurry him, and the second came out plain. The lodge that had been called empty filled for those 2 weeks with the low voices of people assembling the truth. There is a particular hour, near the end of any long labor, when the thing you have been building stops being a hope and becomes a fact, and you can feel the weight of it shift onto its own foundation. Della felt that hour come on a gray afternoon when the last signature was set and the 2 fair copies lay finished on the table, each wrapped in waxed paper as Renner had wrapped his. She had not raised her voice once in 14 days. She had not threatened anyone. She had laid the truth out plank by plank, the way her uncle had taught her to lay a floor, every piece true to its neighbor, no edge standing proud to be pried. And now it could not be taken apart. They did not go to the sheriff who owed money to Tate himself, and Della had marked that name in the ledger too. They went over his head. Mercy Galt knew a circuit judge named Harmon, who came through Virginia City twice a year and had a reputation rare in that country for being unbought. They timed their journey to his sitting. Della and Mercy Galt and Lars Holt rode down out of the mountains with the originals and one fair copy sewn into a flat oilcloth packet against Della's body. And they left the second copy buried back at the lodge beneath the hearthstone, in the room Silas Renner had built. Because a woman who has learned how easily proof can vanish does not carry all of it into one room with the man it will ruin. What happened in Virginia City happened quietly, which is the only way this kind of thing ever truly happens. There was no confrontation in a dusty street. Howell Tate was not dragged from his office. Judge Harmon, a spare gray man who had practiced law in 3 territories and been bought in none of them, received them in his chambers behind the courthouse on a cold, clear morning, and he listened without interrupting while Della laid the originals and the fair copies on his desk and walked him through them the way she had walked the chisel along the hidden tongue, slow and sure, no piece forced. He asked few questions. He asked the right ones. When Mercy Galt told him she had known Silas Renner and known his mind, he looked at her a long moment and seemed to weigh not her words, but the kind of woman who spoke them, and what he found in that weighing satisfied him. Then he did what judges do when the foundation under a respectable man is shown to be rotten. He ordered the original notes seized and examined. He ordered Tate's clean ledger brought in and set beside the originals, and the 2 colors of ink that Della had noticed on her first day in that office, the ruled columns she had filed away without knowing why, became in the judge's hands the very thing that hanged the case, because the corrections in Tate's books matched in their own hand the corrections that had swollen every debt in the mountains. Howell Tate was not a man who fought when the floor gave way beneath him. We are permitted one brief look into him here at the end, and what we find is not remorse but calculation, the same soft arithmetic with which he had built his whole quiet empire, now turned to the problem of saving what he could. He surrendered the notes. He signed the releases. He paid back, under the judge's order, what the court could prove he had taken, which was not all of it but was a great deal. And the men in Silas Renner's ledger walked out of that winter owning their own claims and their own labor for the first time in years. Tate sold his interests and left the territory before the spring, and the country closed over the place where he had been, the way still water closes over a dropped stone. He was not punished as a man like Thomas Pell had wanted him punished. He was simply undone and made small and forgotten, which is a harder and a more lasting thing. Della Voss did not grow rich. The court returned the seized furs to Renner's estate, and as there was no heir to be found, their value went to settle the smallest of the debts he had himself left behind, and Della took from the whole matter only the lodge she had already bought and the $11 she had paid for it, which the judge, with the driest of looks, declined to refund. She had not done it for the furs. She had done it because her uncle had taught her that a floor laid level over uneven ground is a floor laid over something a man did not want walked upon. And she had walked upon it, and she had pried it up, and she had let the light into the room beneath. The men she had helped did not forget her, which is its own kind of payment. Lars Holt squared the lodge's shifted chimney footing and rehung its door on iron hinges he forged himself. Eli Crane brought her a winter's worth of split wood. Ruth Pell sent eggs, and her son Thomas, the angry one, came up one day without a word and dug her a proper root cellar in the good dry ground behind the lodge, so that she would never again have to wonder what a hole in the earth was hiding. And Mercy Galt, who had stood up in a judge's chambers and sworn to a dead man's mind, came up the creek most weeks with honey and with talk. And the 2 women, the old one and the young one, kept a kind of company that the mountains grant to those who have earned each other. The freighters who had laughed in the sawmill yard heard the story, as such men always do. And the next time Della came down to Ennis for supplies, they did not laugh. One of them, the one who had said the only treasure in the cabin was the smell, took off his hat to her in the street which from a man of his sort was nearly a speech. He started to say something, some clumsy thing about how he had not meant it, and then thought better and only stood there with his hat in his hands. She nodded to him and went on about her business. She did not say a word about what she had found, then or ever. And she certainly did not tell him that he had been wrong. There would have been no profit in it, and her uncle had taught her that a man who is being proven foolish does not need to be told so as well. The root cellar behind her lodge, full now of her own turnips and her own salt pork, said it for her, and said it better than she could have. She stayed in the lodge above the Madison for the rest of her life, and she made it a good place, and in time she took in a girl of her own, a half-orphaned child from a family that had not survived a hard crossing, and she set her on a stool beside a bench and put a smoothing plane in her hands before the child could spell her own name. She taught her the weight of timber. She taught her that wood lies the way men lie, by omission, and that the truth of a board is in what sits beneath it. And once, when the child asked her why the hearthstone in the main room sat a little proud of the floor around it, lifted on a frame of square timber so that you stepped up to it, Della told her that a man had once built a room under that floor to hide the truth in, and that she had decided to leave the room open with a stair down to it, and a lamp kept filled at the top of the stair. The strongbox still sat at the foot of those 3 steps, empty now of its ledger and its papers, but kept where it had stood, its hasp open, its lid raised. The 40 pelts were long gone to the court and the settling of old accounts. The room itself Della kept, though, swept and dry and aired, and she went down into it now and then on a still evening, not for anything that was there, but for the cold, clean breath of the under-earth and the memory of the man who had sealed his truth into it, and trusted, without ever knowing her name, that the right hand would one day come and lift the floor. On the last evening of this telling, picture her there, an old woman now, her own dark hair gone the gray of weathered cedar, her uncle's ads hung on a peg by the door where she could reach it, sitting at the top of the stair with a lamp beside her, and looking down into the small square room that a careful man had built and a careful woman had opened. The lodge was not empty. It had never truly been empty. It had only been waiting for someone who knew that the truth of a thing is in what sits beneath it, and who had the patience to kneel down on a cold floor and ask the boards where they were lying. Have you ever found that the thing everyone swore was worthless was the very thing that held the proof? If a story like this one settled something in you, there are others of its kind waiting, of dismissed women, and the things the world threw away, and the quiet justice that patient hands can lift up out of the dark.